The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chayaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Welcome back to Things Are About to Get Weird, and happy Halloween to you all. The big day is upon us, and I hope you've been having a lovely build-up to the spookiest night of the year. For today's Halloween-themed episode, I wanted to mix things up a bit, and rather than telling you a ghost story, I thought I'd opt for a fascinating, strange but true tale that spans several of our subgenres. There are definitely spooky elements, but there's much more to this story. So today, I'm going to be telling you all about the Ghostwatch Halloween hoax. An additional warning before we begin that there will be a mention of a young person taking their own life in this episode. As always, I will handle this section with the utmost care, but I did just want to let you know up front. That said, let's get into the story. The night of October the 31st is something many of us associate with not only trick-or-treating, but scary films, spooky podcasts, or the Halloween specials of our favourite TV shows. And back in 1992, the BBC decided to take a different and genuinely quite groundbreaking approach to their Halloween television offering. For a bit of additional context for anyone listening to this outside of the UK, although the BBC is renowned for its news coverage, they also produce entertainment programmes too. And on this night, 32 years ago, the lines between fact and fiction would become blurred in a way that has been described by many as truly ahead of its time. Now, there are a few key people I need to introduce you to for this story. If you're British or have ever lived in the UK, some of these people might be familiar to you, but this background is valuable all the same. The late Michael Parkinson was a veteran TV broadcaster whose career spanned decades, and to audiences at the time of our story in 1992, he was viewed as a trustworthy, familiar figure who'd regularly appear on the nation's television screens. In the run-up to that Halloween, the BBC had been heavily promoting a one-off special TV show called Ghostwatch. It would be part of a popular primetime anthology series that ran on the BBC called Screen 1 and was due to be fronted by Parkinson, along with 3 other co-presenters. Sarah Green, who was a former Blue Peter children's presenter, her husband, presenter Mike Smith, and the wonderful Craig Charles, who had found fame in the late 80s as part of the cast of sci-fi comedy Red Dwarf. Now, Ghostwatch had been devised by the horror writer Stephen Volk, who had originally written it as though it was a 6-part spooky drama series. But when he joined forces with producer Ruth Baumgarten, she asked him whether he'd be able to adapt the concept to instead be an hour-and-a-half long special. When speaking about this change at a later date, Volk recalled, quote, "I said to her, why don't we do it instead as an investigation, a mystery story, pretending it's a live transmission from a haunted house? I remember that moment very clearly when she was really excited by that." And so, the format of Ghostwatch had begun to form. However, according to Volk, it wasn't all smooth sailing when it came to explaining exactly what they wanted to achieve with the show to BBC executives, and they had to go through several rounds of rewrites before it was finally given the green light. The concept that they were pitching was this. Ghostwatch would be framed as being a live broadcast coming from a family home in Northolt, which is in West London. It would be presented as a paranormal investigation into haunted happenings at the home, with viewers being led to believe that it was completely legitimate, to a certain extent at least. But in reality, it would be a total spoof, with a fake family and a fabricated tale about the ghostly goings-on they were concerned about in their house. The reason I say that the audience was kept on the outside of the true nature of the programme only to a certain extent was because the true mockumentary nature of Ghostwatch was sort of hiding in plain sight. For starters, as I mentioned, it was part of the Screen 1 series, which was made up of standalone dramas or at least dramatizations. Plus, after the presenters had been secured, anticipation really began to build around the show, and the fact that they were all such household names earned Ghostwatch a feature on the front page of the Radio Times before it aired, plus a full article in the magazine. In the piece, it was made clear that the show was in fact going to be a drama, but although the Radio Times was a widely read publication at the time, that didn't mean that everyone who would eventually tune in on the night had read the feature. What this meant is that when Ghostwatch aired at 9:25 p.m. on Halloween night, there were thousands upon thousands of people watching it who fully believed that they were viewing a real paranormal investigation, and that they might even get to see evidence of the poltergeist believed to be terrorizing the Early family, who were placed at the center of the show. In particular, the family's two young daughters, Kim and Suzanne Early. Although in the opening credits there was a quick flash of text on the screen which names Stephen Volk as the writer, everything else about Ghostwatch felt very real, especially to viewers who would have not been used to this collision between factual and scripted entertainment. Today, this is something that we're far more used to. Very few of us would turn on any kind of reality TV program in 2024 and believe that every single event in it was completely authentic and unprompted. We're all quite savvy to the fact that most television content is scripted in some way, but from the get-go, Ghostwatch was taken at face value by many who were tuning in from their living rooms back in 1992. And to be honest, when I think back to things like the live Halloween special of Inside Number 9 that aired in 2018, which is probably the closest thing to Ghostwatch that we've seen since, I still found myself questioning what was real and what wasn't in that at times. So perhaps we're not so different from our early 90s counterparts after all. But back to 1992, Ghostwatch begins with viewers being introduced to what was described as the most haunted house in Britain, where the Early sisters and their mother Pamela were reportedly residing alongside a poltergeist they named Pipes, believed to be the spirit of a former resident of the house, Raymond Tunstall. This nickname came from the idea that the ghoul would bang on the water pipes within the house as a way to scare the family, which is obviously incredibly creepy and something that would feel so invasive, naturally adding to the scare factor. But in actual fact, the family and pretty much everyone else who appeared on screen, bar the presenters, were actors, and the show wasn't live at all. It had been recorded weeks prior, and everything about it had been meticulously scripted to make the final product as spooky as possible. Michael Parkinson was in the TV studio, inviting the audience to call into the show and share their own ghost encounter stories, with the phone number provided being the standard one that was often given out on BBC programmes like Crime Watch, which would have been very familiar to regular viewers. They were told that a team of paranormal investigators had spent the past 10 months scoping out the Early's family home, and the supposedly live footage that Parkinson would throw to from the studio, which was apparently being sent from the house on the night, was made to look very rustic and realistic. It was filmed on videotape, and during the course of the show, things like heat-seeking infrared cameras were used to great effect, with viewers being told that they'd help them spot any spirit activity going on in the house. Whilst Michael Parkinson stayed in the TV studio for the duration of the programme, Sarah Green was stationed at the house following the investigation as it happened, with Mike Smith and Craig Charles acting as additional reporters. The beginning of the show was relatively tame and even jokey at times, but as the 90 minutes progressed, things became more and more tense and significantly scarier. The cameras placed around the house captured the sisters having increasingly more terrifying encounters with Pipes, until it seemed that the poltergeist was actually starting to possess them. Marks and scratches appeared on the girls' faces. Objects appeared to be moving by themselves in the house, and there were no end of odd sounds to be heard. The atmosphere had totally changed. There were no more light-hearted interludes from the reporters, and by the end, even the studio Parkinson stood in appeared largely deserted, aside from odd flashes of a mysterious figure believed to be Pipes. As the show was concluding, it appeared as though the ghost had taken control of the cameras. Emergency services were shown turning up to the house, and as the Manchester Evening News described, quote, by the end of the broadcast, a thoroughly creaked out Green is seen being pulled into the mist-filled cupboard under the stairs by Pipes. A wind then howls through the studio, and the lights blow out as mayhem ensues and its panicked staff flee. Smith can be heard asking after his wife's safety, and Parkinson, with only half his face showing on camera, begins to sing a nursery rhyme before being possessed by the voice of Pipes. Oof, it's sending shivers down my spine, even knowing it was a spoof. I can't imagine how terrifying this would have been to watch at the time. Now, whilst I'm sure there were many people who took Ghostwatch for the fiction it was, not least the team behind the show who were all together having a few drinks as it was airing, their celebrations soon turned to worry. The phone lines connected to the number Parkinson had told viewers to get in touch on were inundated and completely jammed, full of people who were either incredibly scared or very, very angry. Over the hour and a half that Ghostwatch was on air, around 20,000 people had tried to get through to the show. News that producer Ruth Baumgarten broke to Stephen Volk with a tone of clear concern. While some who called were parents of children who had been terrified by what they'd seen on screen, many were loyal BBC viewers who felt angry that they'd been fooled by such an elaborate hoax. Volk has spoken out about this immediate reaction, and his words illustrate the breadth of the issues very well. It's a long quote, but it's fascinating. He said, I worked on the premise that people might believe Ghostwatch was genuinely happening live, or be slightly puzzled for 10 minutes, then twig it was a clever way to do a drama, a ghost story for television. That's all I ever hoped for. It wasn't our aim to fool all of the audience all of the running time or to upset people. It was me simply wanting to scare the audience as I'd been pleasurably scared by BBC ghost stories over the years, whether they be the classic ghost stories for Christmas or the Stone Tape by Nigel Neal. Ghostwatch, in any case, wasn't designed purely as a hoax or gag. You don't get £700,000 out of BBC drama by saying, this will be a jolly good prank. Yes, the number of people fooled was a surprise, but what was more interesting to me was the idea that they had been made to feel a mug by the BBC. That's what really made them angry. Strangely, children had a more malleable attitude to what they were being told. They could accept the manipulation. Adults couldn't. The optimum age to see Ghostwatch seems to be about 12. People who were 12 years old at the time seemed to be the ones who'd come up and tell me how much they loved it. They were utterly terrified, yes, traumatized even, they'd say, but loved it. Reading this, I understood what Volk was saying, especially as I was a child who was obsessed with all things spooky and spent most of my time trying to find sneaky ways to view the latest horror films that were definitely not intended for people my age. He went on to recall certain specific complaints from the total of around 30,000 that were eventually made, including one from a vicar who said although he realised the show wasn't real, he still worried that by broadcasting it, the channel had raised demonic forces of some kind, plus one from a pregnant woman who claimed the show was so terrifying it had induced her labour. All of this is noteworthy, of course, but what no one could have predicted is the tragic turn this story would take 5 days later. On Halloween night, the Denham family from Nottingham had gathered together to watch the BBC special. Percy and April Denham were joined by their sons, Martin, who was 18, and Gavin, who was 14. And April has since recalled that during the 90-minute programme, Martin seemed to become what she described as hypnotised by it. The parents asked their son if he was all right, but have spoken about how he was curled up whilst watching the show and appeared to be agitated. In the days following the release of Ghostwatch, April and Percy noticed that Martin's behaviour had shifted. He began to get very upset if he heard the pipes banging in their house, something which happened frequently as the heating came on and they warmed up. And he also started to speak about ghosts and spirits extensively. What happened next is truly awful. Less than a week after Halloween, Martin took his own life. And in a note to his mother written just before he died, he said, "If there is ghosts, I will now be one, and I will always be with you as one." My heart broke when I read this. I can't imagine how difficult this time must have been for Martin's loved ones. It's truly devastating. Percy Denham later spoke of finding out about Martin's passing, saying, "I went crackers. I started swearing. When I heard about the contents of the note, I knew it was that programme." And April added, "It's still just one big mystery and he isn't here, so I'm not able to ask him." Martin was happy. He had never had any problems. He had got a girlfriend and a job and had got everything to live for. Even though he was a slow learner, he had done well for himself. He had everything going for him, and then it changed, just like that. Now, after this terrible news came to light, and especially after the coroner who investigated Martin's death made no mention of Ghostwatch in his report, the family were determined to see that their complaint was taken seriously. As a result of their campaigning, the Broadcasting Standards Commission, now known as Ofcom, decided to conduct their own investigation into the Halloween special. In their findings, they stated that the BBC, quote, had a duty to do more than simply hint at the deception it was practicing on the audience. In Ghostwatch, there was a deliberate attempt to cultivate a sense of menace. This led the BBC to apologise, and to this day the programme has never again aired on television. In fact, up until the early 2000s, it was never released in any format, as the BBC imposed a 10-year ban on it being put out into the world again. But in 2002, there was a DVD of Ghostwatch made available for purchase, and today you can actually find it on certain streaming services. Most of those involved with the production of the show have said very little about Martin's death publicly, out of respect for the family, although I can only imagine that the news would have come as a real shock to them. The programme's director, Leslie Manning, gave an interview to The Guardian back in 2020, where she stated, "I definitely didn't set out to cause mass hysteria, but I wasn't trying to make it look like a conventional BBC movie either." And in many ways, I think this reflects my own view on the situation too. I don't believe for a second that the Ghostwatch team were trying to cause any genuine, long-lasting distress to anyone. I think that they were trying to do something revolutionary in the television space. And whilst the end result certainly did look menacing, as described in the BSC report, I don't believe it was malicious. At the same time, the news of Martin Denham's death was absolutely terrible. In my eyes, both things are true, and ultimately I just hope that over time his family were able to heal from the loss as much as they were able to. Now, as some of you will know, I am actually a trained journalist. I have a degree in broadcast journalism and previously worked as a television newsreader. And whilst Ghostwatch was a drama rather than news, at least in actuality, it sparked a memory I had that I thought was interesting to mention. While studying for my degree, the BBC editorial guidelines were something I became hugely familiar with, and I suddenly remembered something that had always caught my eye as a fan of all things paranormal. To this day, in the guidelines, there's a section called Hypnotism, Exorcism, the Occult, and the Paranormal. And when I looked this up, I found a few of the points to be very intriguing. For example, in section 5.3.59, it states, Paranormal practices for entertainment purposes, not including drama, film, or comedy, must not be broadcast when a significant number of children are likely to be watching, or to be in our radio audience, or using our online content. And in section 5.3.60, it reads, "At any time, demonstrations of or claims about exorcism, the occult, the paranormal, divination, or any related practices in factual programs must be treated with objectivity appropriate to the output." And this is the important part. In entertainment programs, they must be clearly signposted. After reading this, I tried to find out whether any of these points were written into the guidelines as a result of the Ghostwatch aftermath, but I couldn't find out one way or another. I know that given more time, I could get to the bottom of it, but for now this is purely my own speculation that perhaps there was a link there. I know that the modern guidelines were first published before the program aired, back in 1989, so it could well be unrelated, but I thought it was worth pointing out. Regardless, I think they're largely a good thing, especially the points about children. I've often been asked why I mark my podcast episodes as explicit when I don't actually swear in them, and my reasoning for this is along these same lines. The majority of the topics I feature, from the spookiest stories to things like the true crime tales, are aimed at an adult audience, and I made the choice to designate the episodes as explicit to reflect this. So, whilst the events that directly followed the broadcast of Ghostwatch should of course never be forgotten, what was the legacy impact of this trailblazing piece of media? Well, for one, it seems that many of those who were frightened by it at the time have never quite forgotten how it made them feel. When the Manchester Evening News posted about it on their Facebook page a couple of years ago, they had comment after comment from followers who still remember how they struggled to sleep afterwards, for months on end in some cases, or how it made them cry as it was just too scary. But on a wider scale, Ghostwatch has been credited as something that helped pave the way for hugely popular shows like Most Haunted, and some have even speculated that the rough and ready, homemade style of camera footage used in the programme could have inspired major films like Paranormal Activity and The Blair Witch Project, as well as, naturally, the show I mentioned earlier, Inside Number 9, specifically the Halloween episode Deadline. In fact, Stephen Volk has spoken about this very programme, telling Yahoo News, quote, "I loved the Inside Number 9 Halloween special so much. Really funny and clever. When I heard they were doing it live, I texted Reece Shearsmith and I said, please put in a little nod to Ghostwatch. He texted back, I don't think you'll be disappointed. Of course, it was fantastic. Such fun and dark. I texted him and said how much I'd enjoyed it, and he texted back saying, it was all for you, Stephen. What a lovely gesture, bless him. Then, for the 20th anniversary of the programme, back in 2012, there was a retrospective documentary made about it, entitled Ghostwatch, Behind the Curtains, directed by Rich Lorden. There were interviews with many of the main members of the production team, as well as the presenters and some fans of the show, and the tagline on the documentary's poster was 20 years in the making. This is an interesting point, as from what I've been able to find, it does appear that as the decades have gone by, some of those who were involved with it appear to have become more publicly vocal about the programme. Of course, this could be a coincidence. After all, there is lots more news content being produced every day now thanks to the internet, as opposed to the 90s, but it was just something that caught my attention. And on that note, despite the show making such negative headlines, which began the very next morning after broadcast, it seems as though most people involved with Ghostwatch, including Michael Parkinson, stood by the episode in terms of what they had achieved creatively, which arguably was as groundbreaking as it was controversial. From even just a quick search online, you can see that there are still posts on internet forums popping up today discussing the episode, largely from fans who who remember watching it live and who still regard it as an impactful and somewhat legendary piece of work, something of real significance in this niche corner of 90s pop culture. Despite this, Stephen Volk has stated that he's not overly keen on the idea of ever producing a sequel, or to explore the world he created in Ghostwatch any further. When asked about this, his response has been, "It was what it was." And what I think he means by this is that it was of its time, and that's all it was intended to be. The team behind the program have often said in different ways that it wasn't necessarily designed to be a hoax or a prank in the traditional sense, and I get the impression that what they really wanted was for it to be a subversive take on the horror genre. It's been noted that by hiring such well-known hosts, especially those who were trusted by a younger audience too, that this could have added to the intense realism of what was being shown on screen. And I also understand this point. At the end of it all, there's one question that I think remains at the heart of this story. Could it be that Ghostwatch was simply too ahead of its time? Well, I think this might be one of the most unique stories I've covered on Things Are About to Get Weird to date. It was such an intriguing yet desperately sad tale to explore. I would be fascinated to know, 1, whether you'd ever heard about Ghostwatch before, 2, if you've ever seen it, and 3, if you'd ever be tempted to watch it if its existence is new to you, obviously with the prior knowledge that it is a work of fiction. I'm going to be keeping an eye out for all of your comments about this story. I have a feeling that there's going to be a real mixed bag of answers to my questions, so as always, please do feel free to let me know your thoughts. But for now, it's time to completely change gears for our outro feature. So let's head right on over to Weird Media. As pretty much everything about the podcast has been spooky themed for the past couple of weeks, I wanted to go in a completely different direction for Weird Media today, because if you're like me, after diving into some of their heavier or stranger stories out there, you might just enjoy a comedy-based palate cleanser. And in my opinion, this is one of the funniest things you could ever treat your ears to. I know lots of you will already be completely familiar with this podcast, but if you're not, oh my goodness, prepare yourselves. So a good few years ago now, I started listening to My Dad Wrote a Porno, and I immediately became obsessed with it. There aren't that many things that make me laugh out loud the entire way through, but this is one. I got a few series into the podcast, and then life completely got in the way, and it was only recently that I picked it up again and finished listening. It's just one of my favourite pieces of media of all time. If you have no clue what I'm talking about, let me explain. In the podcast, the presenter Alice Levine and her 2 friends, Jamie Morton and James Cooper, sit down together each week for a very unique and bizarre reason. After Jamie made the discovery that his dad, who goes by the pen name Rocky Flintstone, had written a series of adult fiction books that were so bad that they were plain hilarious, the trio decided that the world needed to hear them too. And so, each episode, Jamie reads a chapter of the series, which is called Belinda Blinked, to Alice and James, and the results are comedy gold. I was going to say that every book is more unhinged than the last, but it's to the point where every new sentence is more wild than you could ever anticipate. You literally never know what's coming next, and I have cried with laughter listening to the podcast more times than I can count. On a recent plane journey, I listened to episodes I downloaded for 4 hours straight, and I laughed almost the entire time. My husband was sat next to me and he was like, "Are you okay?" Oh, it's honestly just one of the best podcasts ever made in my eyes. The show came to an end a couple of years ago now, but if you were to get into it, you'd have so many episodes to enjoy, and it's the kind of thing that you could re-listen to and it would be just as funny the second time round. Are you a fellow Belinker? Let me know what you think of My Dad Wrote a Porno if you have listened, and if you do decide to give it a whirl, just make sure that there aren't any kids in earshot. It's pretty graphic and definitely one to use your headphones for, but it's truly an absolute treat. Okay, time for our source shoutouts. There was actually a brilliant and very frank article from the BBC themselves about the Ghostwatch controversy. That was by Rebecca Woods and it was published in October of 2017, as well as, of course, the editorial guidelines document I referred to towards the end. We had an article from The Guardian that was formed of a series of interviews by George Bass from October 2020. There was the Manchester Evening News piece I mentioned a couple of times. That was by Damon Wilkinson and Stephen White, published in October 2022. We had an article from The Independent by Roisin O'Connor, written in October 2017. And finally, there was a fantastic piece on Yahoo News by Steve O'Brien. That one was from August of 2023. As I say, I can't wait to hear your takes on this story. So here are all of the ways that you can get in touch. On Instagram and Threads, we are at Things Get Weird Podcast. On TikTok, we are at Things Are About to Get Weird. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching for the podcast name. Over there, you'll find our main page and our private discussion group. Our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, I would hugely appreciate a quick rating or review wherever you're listening. They really do help out the show so much. Plus, don't forget about the comments function if you're listening on Spotify. It's a great way to share your thoughts. Thank you all once again for being here today. And of course, happy Halloween. I hope you have a fun and safe 31st of October. I'll be back soon with more strange but true stories for you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.